In the autumn of 1887, in a narrow townhouse on Abingdon Street in Westminster, a household physician named Dr. George Hartwell made a notation in his private medical ledger, a notation that would not be read again for over 100 years. The entry, written in a cramped, slanting hand, describes a house call made on the morning of the 3rd of November. He had been called to see a Mrs. Elspeth Corby, who had been suffering for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of what he called a persistent nervous exhaustion, compounded by a failure of appetite and sleeplessness of the most debilitating kind. He had tried the usual measures: laudanum in reduced quantities, cold compresses, a restriction of stimulating foods and society. None of it had worked. Then, on this particular morning, something changed. Hartwell arrived to find the patient sitting upright in her chair by the window. Color had returned to her face. Her breathing was measured. Her hands were folded without their usual tremor. On the table beside her sat a small lacquered music box. Its lid was open. Its mechanism was still turning. He pressed his stethoscope to her chest and stood very still, listening. Later, in the same cramped hand, he wrote something that was underscored twice. The rhythm of her heart had conformed to the rhythm of the instrument. The entry ends there. No conclusion follows, no prescription issued, no diagnosis revised. Just the underline, and the date, and then the next patient. The ledger itself was discovered in 2003 by a librarian at the Wellcome Collection in London. It had been tucked into the spine of a donated volume of medical case histories. She assumed it was unremarkable. She filed it provisionally. It sat in a labeled archival box, uncatalogued, for another 11 years, until a postgraduate researcher named Alison Fairweather opened it, looking for something else entirely, and found Dr. Hartwell's double underline staring back at her from across more than a century. The discovery did not make headlines. It was not published. But Fairweather spent the following 18 months tracing what Hartwell had recorded, not because it was unique, but because it was not. The music box in the Victorian home was never only a decorative object. The official history says otherwise. The shop records say otherwise. The patent applications say otherwise. The illustrated catalogs of firms like Nicole Frères and Bremond say otherwise. The household manuals that line the shelves of every heritage archive say otherwise. They describe the music box as an instrument of entertainment, a conversation piece, a gift. But beneath them, in the marginalia, the personal letters, the physician's notebooks, the unpublished domestic guides, a different account accumulates. One piece at a time, like the slow turning of a pinned cylinder. It is an account of medicine. The Swiss watchmakers who first mass-produced musical mechanisms in the 1810s understood something about sound that would not be formally articulated for another century. They had no vocabulary for it. They worked instead by instinct and by ear, by the subtle calibration of steel pins against brass combs, adjusting the spacing of teeth to produce tones that were not merely pleasing, but that seemed to act upon the listener in ways difficult to name. One craftsman's letter, dated to approximately 1819 and preserved in the Cantonal Archive in Geneva, describes this quality in language that feels almost clinical. He writes to a business partner in Lyon about a certain tuning arrangement, one he refers to only as the low sequence. He writes that it had a noticeable effect on customers who heard it demonstrated in the workshop. Pregnant women grew calmer. Men with headaches reported relief. An elderly woman with a condition he describes as shaking of the limbs sat for 40 minutes listening, and told him afterward that for the first time in months she had felt nothing moving inside her that should not move. He does not pursue the observation further. He returns in the next paragraph to a discussion of spring tension and casing costs. The history of how the music box became a domestic medical instrument is not a history of invention. It is a history of accumulation, of quietly repeated observation, shared among households and physicians through channels that were never formal enough to leave clean records. By the 1840s, when the cylinder music box had spread from Swiss workshops into the drawing rooms of the English middle classes, the practice was already in circulation, not as an official therapy, not endorsed by the medical establishment, but in the domestic sphere, the sphere governed not by doctors but by women. The music box had acquired a second function. By the 14th of March, 1851, in the town of Bristol, a woman named Margaret Ashton was writing in a letter to her sister in Edinburgh. The letter is preserved in the Bristol Record Office, misfiled under a collection of household accounts. Its domestic intimacy had apparently rendered it invisible to the archivists who sorted the papers, decades ago. Ashton writes with the matter-of-fact authority of someone describing a practice well established enough to require no justification. Her husband suffered from what she calls attacks of the nerves, episodes almost certainly consistent, across the distance of a century, with panic, with palpitations, with the racing disconnection we now name anxiety. When an attack began, she writes, she would wind the music box and place it on the table beside him, and then leave the room. It is better, she notes, that he not observe me observing him. The box would play, he would lie still. Within the length of one full rotation, roughly 4 minutes, the attack would subside. She offers no theory, she does not speculate about why this works. She records it the way she records that bread kept better in the cool larder, as a fact of household management. The letter offers one detail that deserves more than a passing glance. She specifies that the music box must be wound to full tension and allowed to play without interruption. If the mechanism runs slow, if the spring is half wound, she writes that the effect is diminished. And once, on an occasion where the box had not been properly attended to, it stopped entirely midway through a piece, and the attack returned with renewed violence. The timing, in other words, mattered. The continuity mattered, and this was understood. Fairweather published a short paper in 2016 in a specialist journal of Victorian domestic history. It was titled, with the dry understatement of academic convention, Therapeutic Uses of Mechanical Music in the 19th Century Home. The paper attracted modest attention in its field. It cited 17 separate primary sources from 7 different archives across England, Scotland, Switzerland, and France. Every source described, in language unique to its author and context, the same basic practice: a repetitive, metronomically consistent musical sound, produced by a mechanism that could be relied upon not to alter tempo or volume, administered in proximity to a person in physiological or psychological distress. Not one of these sources described this as medicine. Not one used the word therapy or treatment. Time equals 400 milliseconds. They used the words quiet and comfort and good for the nerves, and those words were enough. In Paris, by the winter of 1863, the connection had grown specific enough to reach the threshold of the professional medical community. Though it arrived there sideways, as most suppressed knowledge does, a French physician named Dr. Émile Renard, who practiced at a private clinic near the Rue de Rivoli, wrote in his published casebook a chapter on what he called the sonic regulation of the vasomotor system. The chapter is dense, technical, and confident. He describes experiments in which patients with irregular heart rhythms were exposed to sustained musical tones at specific pitches and tempos. He reports measurable changes in pulse rate. He names frequencies. Time equals 300 milliseconds greater than he names durations. He names outcomes. The chapter was removed from the second edition of the casebook, published in 1866. In the copy held at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, a penciled annotation in the margin of the contents page notes only: supprimé, révision éditoriale, suppressed, editorial revision, no reason is given, no other chapter was altered. On the 7th of September, 1872, in a workshop in Sainte Croix in the Jura Mountains, a craftsman named Henri Aubert filed a patent application with the Federal Institute of Intellectual Property. The application is unusual. Rather than describing a new mechanism or cabinet design, Aubert's application describes what he calls a therapeutic cylinder, a pinned drum designed not to play recognizable melodies, but to produce a sequence of tones at specific intervals. At a tempo he describes as corresponding to the measured breath of the sleeping body. He claims, in clinical language unusual for a patent document, that the device has been demonstrated to normalize the irregular beating of the cardiac muscle. In a series of 62 trials conducted over the preceding 18 months, the patent was denied. The rejection notice cites insufficient demonstration of novelty. Someone, an examiner's assistant perhaps, has written in the margin in pencil 3 words: "Nicht for Handel, not for commerce." Aubert's therapeutic cylinder was never manufactured commercially. No surviving examples are known. But in the estate inventory of a physician's practice in Bern, compiled in 1901 upon the death of one Dr. Franz Nessler, a music box is listed among the medical instruments. Between the stethoscope and the percussion hammer, between the lancet case and the obstetric measure, its maker is not named, its purpose is not described. It is simply there, in that company, where it had apparently always belonged. The mainstream music box industry continued through the final decades of the 19th century to describe its products exclusively in the language of entertainment. The catalogs of the Nicole Frères firm advertised their mechanisms as elegant additions to the drawing room. Delightful gifts for persons of refined taste. The language never wavers. The measurements they provide are of cabinet dimensions and price, not of frequency or duration or therapeutic output. And yet, in the private correspondence of an Evelina Grange, a Norfolk housewife who kept meticulous letters to her physician brother in Edinburgh between 1878 and 1895, a different catalog exists. She describes, over those 17 years, a collection of 7 music boxes maintained in her household, each assigned, in her own private notation, to a specific purpose. One she calls the sleeping box, a mechanism whose cylinder plays at a tempo she has established, through trial, to be the most reliably effective for inducing sleep in her youngest child. Time equals 400 milliseconds, greater than /a child who suffered from what sounds, across the distance of a century, like childhood anxiety disorder. Another she calls the fever box, which she plays during febrile illness, not because it cures the fever, but because it reduces, she writes, the derangement of the senses that attends high temperature, particularly the auditory hallucinations her eldest son experienced when ill. Her brother's replies, also preserved, bound with the same ribbon, do not question her practices. He responds to her medical reports with the equanimity of a man who considers what she is describing to be within the normal range of domestic medical knowledge. He does not tell her it is superstition. He does not tell her it is harmless placebo. He asks once in a letter dated the 22nd of January, 1882, whether she has tried the longer cylinder for the fever case. As the rhythm sustained over greater duration appears to be the operative principle, he knew, they both knew. The knowledge was simply never going anywhere official. The operative principle, the thing that made the music box work as a medical instrument, was articulated with proper scientific vocabulary only in the 20th century. Though the phenomenon itself had been observed in laboratories since at least the 1860s. Entrainment, the tendency of biological rhythms to synchronize with external rhythmic stimuli, the heartbeat, the breath, the cycling of sleep and waking. Under the sustained influence of a rhythmic external signal, these internal rhythms will gradually conform to the external pattern. The effect is not instantaneous. It requires duration and consistency. It requires that the stimulus not vary in tempo or interrupt itself. A half-wound music box that stops mid-cylinder, as Margaret Ashton noted in 1851, fails precisely because entrainment requires continuity. The Victorians did not know the word. They knew the effect. They encoded the knowledge in domestic practice, in private letters, in marginalia, in the quiet instruction passed from mother to daughter about which box played at what tempo for which condition. By the 1890s, as the cylinder music box gave way to the disc machine, something began to shift. The disc machine was a performance instrument. It filled a room. It commanded attention rather than creating a field of sustained tone in which a patient could rest. The intimate metronomic quality of the cylinder mechanism, the quality that made it medically effective, was not what the market wanted in the age of the phonograph. Music in the home was becoming spectacle rather than treatment. The transition happened quickly. Between 1895 and 1905, cylinder music box production in Switzerland fell by more than 60%. The firms that survived pivoted to ornamental mechanisms, automata, singing birds, carillon clocks, objects whose medical applications, if any had existed, were now wholly submerged beneath their decorative function. On the 3rd of April, 1902, in the city of Leicester, a woman named Ruth Pembridge gave away her grandmother's music box to a local charity sale. She wrote a short note for the attached label. In good condition, plays 3 airs, belonged to my grandmother, who used it for the benefit of the household. The note survives because the box ended up in a collection of Victorian domestic objects donated to the Leicester Museum in 1967. The curator who processed the donation filed the note with the object. She did not annotate it. She did not know what the benefit of the household meant, and she did not ask. What Ruth Pembridge was giving away without knowing it was a technology whose purpose no longer had a home in the world that surrounded her. The medical function of the music box had not been disproven. It had simply been outpaced, left behind by a culture moving too quickly toward new forms to stop and inventory what it was discarding. The knowledge did not disappear. It dispersed. It passed into the informal registers of nursing practice and maternal care, shed of its mechanics but not of its principle. Through the first decades of the 20th century, nurses in children's wards across Britain and Europe continued to recommend, without formal instruction, that mechanical lullaby devices be played in proximity to distressed infants. The devices were different, small clockwork mechanisms, eventually battery-powered units, but the principle was the same: sustained, unvarying, rhythmic sound, at a moderate tempo. The documents that formalize this practice are sparse. The practice simply was. On the 14th of May, 1967, in a neonatal intensive care unit in the city of Boston, a nurse named Patricia Halloran wrote in a unit logbook. She noted that the premature infants in her care showed measurably improved vital signs when a small mechanical music box, brought from home by the parent of one infant, was left playing in the ward. She wrote this as an observation, not a recommendation. She did not know she was documenting the continuation of a practice already 150 years old. The logbook was retired when the unit moved to new facilities in 1974. Its contents were not formally analyzed. But other people were, by that point, beginning to look at the same phenomenon with the equipment of a different era. By the mid-1970s, studies in acoustic biology and the emerging field of music therapy were beginning to produce peer-reviewed language for what the Victorian household had encoded in practice. The term entrainment entered the clinical vocabulary. Research on the effects of rhythmic stimulation on neonatal autonomic function began to appear in respected journals. The mechanisms being described were precisely the mechanisms that Margaret Ashton had documented in 1851, and that Dr. Emile Renard had documented in 1863 before someone removed his chapter. No connection was made. The Victorian archive was not consulted. The music box was not mentioned. The knowledge was reinvented from the beginning, as if for the first time, which is what happens to suppressed knowledge. It waits. It resurfaces. It arrives without its history, scrubbed clean of continuity, as if it had no precedent. In 2018, in a hospital in Amsterdam, a unit testing sound-based therapies for patients in intensive care introduced a new protocol: rhythmic acoustic stimulation, delivered through small bedside speakers at tempos, calibrated to match and gradually decelerate the target heart rate. The protocol was described in the published report as a novel intervention. The results were significant. Heart rate variability improved. Patient anxiety, measured by cortisol markers, decreased. The duration of mechanical ventilation in a subset of patients was shortened. The report cited no historical precedent. There was no mention of Swiss cylinder mechanisms, no mention of Victorian domestic practice, no mention of the physicians who had documented the same outcomes a century and a half earlier, in ledgers now housed in archives that no one in the Amsterdam unit had reason to visit. On a shelf in a house in Edinburgh, as of a survey conducted in 2022, there is a music box that belonged to the great-great-grandmother of the house's current owner. It plays 3 airs. The mechanism is a cylinder type, almost certainly Swiss, almost certainly from the 1870s or 1880s. The spring still wins. The comb still sounds. The owner knows only that it is old and that it works. She keeps it on the shelf because it is beautiful, because it was her family's, because when she winds it at the end of a difficult day and lets it run its full rotation in the quiet of the room, she finds that something in her settles. She does not know why. She does not have a word for it. She does not know that Margaret Ashton wrote about this in 1851, or that Evelina Grange catalogued it across 17 years of letters, or that a craftsman named Henri Aubert tried and failed to patent the underlying mechanism in 1872, or that Dr. Emile Renard documented it in a chapter that someone later removed. She knows only that it works. And she knows, in the way that practical domestic knowledge persists even after its formal justification has been erased, that it must be wound to full tension, that it must not be interrupted, that it must be allowed to play to the end. The music box sits on its shelf in Edinburgh, and the city moves outside the window. And inside the room, for the length of one slow rotation, something in the air conforms to something in the mechanism. The dates do not align, the records do not connect. The knowledge passed through channels too informal to archive. It arrived without its history, and was reinvented by people who did not know they were repeating a discovery already made by women writing letters in 1851. The cylinder turns, the pins catch the comb teeth, the sound spreads through the quiet room. And whatever it is that the Victorians understood, whatever it is that Dr. Hartwell noticed that November morning when he pressed his stethoscope to Mrs. Corby's chest and heard her heart keeping time with the box, it persists, unnamed, unpublished, working,